Well, it's telling me it's showtime, and I'm going to check in with our producer, Laurie Strickland, about sound quality and image, sound and image and picture. We have, this is the beginning of our season 8 of Journey of an Aesthete podcast. Your host, Mitch Hampton, and that means we've done 7 years of this show. And we inaugurated it in the summer, in July, roughly around this time. Not exactly to the date, but this general time. I do a show when I'm able to do them, and when I feel comfortable doing and prepared. And of course, all episodes that are solo are different, depending upon subject. But I want to delve into the word or words that make up the title of the show, and the noun identity of aesthete and aesthetics. A-E-S-T-H-E-T-E, A-E-S-T-H, E-T-I-C-S, the different formulations of that word. And it's a mysterious topic. It's a large, big topic, and I'm going to try to come to it from an idiosyncratic way, by which I mean my own personal biography of when I first encountered the word and what I make of it, and why it and not other things. I mean, it is distinguished largely by what it isn't and what it's autonomous from. It's a fundamental mode of human existence, and I realize now that I have to gather my readings, such as we have here. So I'm going to start off with the first time I think I encountered the word. And it wouldn't have been, the very first time I encountered the word, but would have been early that I became conscious of aesthetics or aesthete as a kind of powerful, independent entity. And it was actually in an interview with the late, great Harold Bloom, from 1991. I'm going to go back to the interview because he discusses the matter. And then I'm going to go through some of the older texts that talk about this, mainly Immanuel Kant, his Critique of Judgment. He wrote many in the 1750s. Critique of Judgment, similar to the Critique of Reason, and some of the philosophers from Germany like him. We start off with this interview. Now, this is an interview from 1991, and it's an interesting time. The Berlin Wall having just come down, and so he was. I don't want the subject to be Bloom himself necessarily. We're kind of just using him as an entry point into some of these other things. And so in the introduction, it talks about how he had just written the Book of J, his plea for adding this book to the Bible, and his claim that J was a woman, and that's of course biblical scholarship and controversies in biblical scholarship. I don't want to get sidetracked by that necessarily, but it's a rather traditional interview, and I'm going to leave out some of Bloom's more controversial comments, but I do want to enter into this word. So he says he grew up East European Jewry, coming to New York, of course, Orthodox, Yiddish. They spoke Yiddish in his home growing up in the 30s. The Hebrew Bible. He discovers Hart Crane in the library. And then he became he fell under the influence of what we would call the new criticism, which was the dominant mode of critical inquiry or artistic humanities inquiry in part of the midsection of the 20th century. Although he himself was not a new critic per se, and he says, he fell under the sway of those folks. But there's a passage here he talks about. He describes falling in love with reading. He says when he learned to read, it was love. He desperately fell in love with reading poems, chiefly. He says, I still love reading a poem when I can find a really good one to read. And this is an interesting admission here. He says, I'm just sitting down, alas, for the first time in several years, reading through Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida at one sitting. So the kind of person Bloom was, is he would read in one sitting, reread Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida. He says, I found it to be an astonishing experience, powerful and superb. That hasn't dimmed or diminished, but surely it is a value in itself, a reality in its own right. Surely it cannot be reduced or subsumed under some other name. So already he's introducing this notion of this is a kind of object in the world. And by object in the world, I don't necessarily mean physical objects like a novel or a poem or a play or a sculpture, although it often is those. It could be an actor's performance on a stage. It could be performance of non-verbal music, music without words, instrumental music. I'm putting those all under the rubric of aesthetics. But he's talking about this kind of, he's saying, is this a kind of an object or kind of a thing that's distinguished from other kinds of things? Now, of course, in our moment now, I'm going to briefly touch on our moment now. In a moment now, these distinctions are not made, largely because of the influence, mainly, I think, of political activists. I mean, I don't want to single them out only, although they are highly blameworthy in this regard, because for the past 30 years, and both parties, both conservative and radical political activists, have subsumed inquiry experience under forms of morality and politics or ethics, and have collapsed the distinction between these such things and aesthetics. And that's been kind of a I encountered that mode of understanding artistic work rather early. I encountered it in my 20s, in the 80s. Teens in the 80s. And I did not register it as such. I knew it was big, but I didn't know it would take over sort of the world. So in this sense, Bloom is kind of, I guess he could say, a rearguard action, because he's trying to, well, let him speak rather than me babbling on and on. He invents this phrase that he calls the school of resentment. I don't want to rehash that here. Resentment meaning people who are motivated to change the world, to be activists. And they are moved by this moral activism to hold that above all other considerations, namely things like poems and are they any good, or music isn't any good. These kinds of considerations. And so He's saying that's taken over, but he says he's influenced by John Ruskin. In this interview, he calls Ralph Waldo Emerson a god. And he complains that there are people who are English majors that have, as he says in his words, read a great deal of Foucault and Jacques Derrida, but have never read Shakespeare and Milton. Now, if you're someone like Bloom, to not read Shakespeare and Milton is to not have read really anything. In other words, you're missing the most important or the most valuable. From this point of view, and it's adjacent to my point of view. Although I'm much, I should say, I'm leaving out some of Bloom because I'm much more egalitarian, relative to him. More egalitarian. I'm not egalitarian at all about artistic evaluation in of itself, but relative to him, I am. As I would include many things into the category of concern, interest, attention, artistic or otherwise, that he would not. I mean, he likes W.C. Fields, as it comes out of here. W.C. Fields was at a time a work of mass culture, popular culture, as a comedian. W.C. Fields was not an obscure poet in any respect, comedian, entertainer, so even he himself includes many things that we would call popular. And, all throughout our podcast, I've been calling into question the distinction between high and low. Having said all of that, there are still evaluations to be had, and some films are better than other films. And I implicitly will touch on that. So I want to get to the part where he talks about aesthetics. Well, there's two things. Of course, there's the thing about the uniqueness of Shakespeare, and the uniqueness for Bloom, why he would hold Shakespeare above other folks, above maybe Ben Jonson, of course, for example, or certainly other people, is Bloom's claim that Shakespeare introduces people changing, to put it really in a humble, homely fashion. Characters thinking to themselves out loud for the audience, the monologue, right? And undergoing some kind of basic change. Now, this is something that, as he says, we take it utterly for granted in all of our drama and our literature and our art. But at one time, that was quite new. There was a more fixed notion of personality, fixed notion of character. People do not think to themselves and go back and forth to and fro and undergo a change. Of course, our producer's favorite play and favorite text by Dickens, of course, is this very mode of a character. Scrooge reflects on things, is visited by ghosts, and then undergoes a kind of a change. Goes, as he says, becoming one kind of character, being one kind of character, becoming another kind of character. We call it reform. And this is something we take for granted. And Bloom says this is quite new in Shakespeare, and he says this is all over Shakespeare. So it isn't just in some plays, it happens all of the time into many of his characters. And that's what he says here. He says, a representation of characters or human figures speaking out loud, whether to themselves or to others or both, and then brooding out loud. It's important that it's out loud. It's a public deliberation, even if it's only meant for the audience or the reader and not for any other characters in the scene. It's still out loud. We're exposed to it. Kind of an interior monologue. Whether themselves or others or both, or what they reflect upon what they themselves have just said. So they said it, they think it, and they reflect upon it. And then in the course of pondering, undergoing a serious or vital change. And they become a different kind of character or personality. And even a different kind of mind. We take that utterly for granted in representation, but it does not exist before Shakespeare. Again, we can debate whether it's true or not. It doesn't happen in the Bible. It doesn't happen in Homer. It doesn't happen in Dante. It doesn't even happen in Euripides. It's pretty clear that Shakespeare's true precursor, the person that comes closest, and where he got the hint to do this from, is Chaucer, which is why I think the wife of Bath gets into Falstaff, and the pardoner gets into figures like Edmund and Iago. He comes back to Iago because it's Edmund and Iago. That's part of Chaucer's shocking originality as a writer. And so that's an example of a point of view. This is not an episode about Shakespeare, episode about Edmund and these plays. It's an episode about aesthetics. And Shakespeare, of course, is a much rarefied still example of human creation. And it's also an example of something quite rarefied that became universal, that is, for everybody. So it's most interesting case of something that's very highbrow, but is everywhere and done relatable. And as I've said in an episode I did recently with a Shakespeare scholar, I could talk about that. So we're talking about aesthetics as a certain kind of thing. So one way I can think about it is that it is, to use a contemporary vogue word, if it is a vogue word, it may seem kind of old to be a vogue word, but it's in vogue now. Vibe. So it's sort of a way of talking about the vibe of a thing without more specific content of a thing. You get sort of a vibe. And so here it comes. Bloom says there's a school of resentment, and it's these activists and these censors, you know. And the interviewer asked Bloom, how does one react to all of this? By declaring oneself an aesthete? And Harold Bloom says, well, I do that now. Of course, in furious reaction. I would certainly see myself as an aesthete in the sense advocated by John Ruskin, indeed to a considerable degree by Emerson, and certainly by Walter and the Sublime Oscar, meaning Oscar Wilde, I think. The Sublime Oscar is a very engaged mode. And so I'm going to try a little bit to talk about the word as it's traveled. There's a book, this book, Children of the Sun, which is about the Brits after 1918 and before the 50s and 60s, and the different schools in Oxford and Cambridge in which these words are used. And that's kind of been an interesting book in order to inquire about this. Now, I'm going to check. I had to make notes for this episode because it's such a big topic, of course. And I see now that one of my books for the episode is in the other room. So I'm going to take a drink of coffee, play music. I won't play music, but it'll take me 1 second to grab this. Too many books. So as you can see, this is an interview from 1991. And the subject that comes from this book is all about the crisis in the universities. So what are people talking about now? Are crises in universities. And as Bloom points out, these modes of existence, being an activist, for example, being a humanitarian, being an artist, are not mutually exclusive. Many are both. But I think he's saying that there is this primacy of the aesthetic dimension, which I'm calling the vibe of a room or a thing or a scene, or the appearance of a kind of a design. What kind of design? So this is a book called What Art Is from Arthur Danto. So also in the 90s, I was in Portland, Oregon, and we had a date with a woman named Jan, and she said, do you want to go to the Portland Art Museum and see Arthur Danto lecture on Brillo pads and Warhol or whatever else, which actually is the cover of this. See the Brillo pad? So and I said, sure, we'll go do that. And I went to this lecture of Arthur Danto, who wrote The Transfiguration of the Commonplace and many other texts. And one thing I'll always, during that lecture, he named some then well-known, sometimes controversial, sometimes anodyne artists, like Chris Burden, who damaged himself in his performance work, or Cindy Sherman, or Karen Finley, if you know these references of that era of Mapplethorpe and these things. And a long lecture, and I'm sitting here next to Jan watching Arthur Danto, and at the very end of his lecture, he says the phrase, I can like it all. I can like it all. And then he stopped and everybody clapped. And that's always stayed with me. Sort of the permission, I can like it all, which itself can mean different things. It could be the capacity to comprehend the all, to even be able to enjoy it, because comprehension sometimes, there's that debate with E.H. Gombrich who says that we either like or dislike something, and only then can we understand or learn. So there has to be an initial attraction or repulsion. the contrary view to Gombrich, which is that, well, if you don't like something, it's because you don't understand it. And you have to do the work to comprehend, and then you might like it. There's that. That's a more dominant view. I think the latter is not the case, but it's the dominant one. But he says, I can like it all, which means that he has permission as an art critic, as a great art historian, to like many different kinds of things. And so I'm going to this book, and so he mentions aesthetics, and he says something similar to what I'm trying to say here in this episode. And this has been the word and he says here in a chapter called The Future of Aesthetics, it's the chapter that shows you that aesthetics has a future from the point of view. He says, and philosophers of art, like Danto himself and many others, David Hickey, the book Air Guitar, I'm just naming some of the, Rosalind Krauss, these names. Philosophers of art said to have focused almost exclusively on, quote, how we define a work of art and the role played by art world institutions in that definition, unquote, now ask if they have not lost sight of, quote, what is valuable about art, unquote, identifying that with aesthetics. The question that interests me is what the impact will be if aesthetics really is restored to its alleged prior role. So there's a sense of a narrative of having it been lost, aesthetics, and we want to restore it to its prior role, that it somehow lost its place, aesthetics, By aesthetics, I shall mean, this is a pretty damn close to a definition you ever get from Danto. By aesthetics, I shall mean the way things show themselves together with the reasons for preferring one way of showing itself to another. The way things show themselves and the preference for one way of showing itself to another way. So already there's the way, the vibes, the feeling, but there's also already intimately connected with that evaluation of all kinds. If we are human-centric creatures, we are, by mere existence, always evaluating, using that word in the most capacious sense, It's something that we're doing, just like I'm drinking this cup of coffee, and it's a good cup of coffee, right? And even in that, we have distinctions like serviceable versus great. I don't know if it's great, it's very serviceable. It's doing its job as coffee. So I don't quite know where to proceed, as I always say. I think we need to get to Kant because he's one of the earliest. There is one other scholar that might be, in some senses, as important as Kant. They were friends, and they commented earlier, but his work, he wrote a work called Aesthetics, and that's Baumgarten. But Baumgarten's work, Aesthetics, has never been translated into English since the 1750s. Someone should do it. So if there's anybody out there, German, English, translate it so we can have a translation of it. At least I haven't been able to find it, but I did find this Kant. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk about the critique of the power of judgment. Now, a lot of folks that I've been mentioning, like Immanuel Kant, Baumgarten, are in large, I'm going to say this because it needs to be said, actually. Amazingly, that what I'm going to say needs to be said. They're actually kind of well known. They come down to us because they're good in some respect. So Immanuel Kant, people can get really tongue-tied and contorted is Kant correct? Should I be a Kantian? That's entirely the wrong way, at least from the point of view of this episode, of looking at it, because it isn't. Of course, he's getting some things right. That's part of his goodness. But Kant is good in the way Charles Dickens is good, in the way the Shakespeare mentioned, that he comes down to us. He's sort of famous, and people have to be taught him a lot in schools, and his name comes up a lot, and they have discussion of him because, like, what he did had value and it was good. That is not to say that he's always correct, and that's not to say that he is without sins. Even for a philosopher, this might be shocking to say, even without contradictions, inconsistencies, even vices, prejudices in the negative sense. All those things might be in him. But he gets certain things right, and he's taught over century after century after century, just as Dickens might be taught, or Shakespeare might be taught, because there's some value there. And that's the sense in which big names are big, at least in this context, big for sort of good reasons. It is not a mere PR campaign. It isn't like a group of philosophers in Germany and Great Britain in the 1760s or 1770s said, well, he's German like we are, so we got to put him on a rock or put him on a map or a stamp. It's a bit more than that. And it's mainly his contribution. So we're going to go and we're going to open up the very earliest writings on aesthetics itself. First section of the first book, Analytic of the Beautiful, Analytic of the Aesthetic Power of Judgment, from Critique of Judgment. And where are we here? We have, usually they have the date here when it was done, and I'm going to guess division of the entire work. I think 1750, somewhere in there, 1750, 60. Okay, 1790. So it's quite a bit later. So I'm confused with another text. So we're at the 1790, 93 are two different editions. So we're at the very end of the 18th century. And Immanuel Kant, created a lot of what we now call catchphrases. And one of them I mentioned in an earlier episode, which have the courage of your convictions. Kant was the first one to say that. His formulation is, dare to use your own reason, not someone else's reason. Have the courage of your convictions is a commonplace motto that comes from him. And there's some things we're going to get to hear that are sort of common. And again, the mode that I'm going to read this in is going to treat this as an aesthetic object, work of philosophy. And again, many aspects of aesthetics are ideational and conceptual, in which case they contain within them quite ethical, moral. They contain within them verdicts and declarations on things about right and wrong and good and bad. And you have in drama characters who are villains and who are saintly, right? Or somewhere in between, all shades in between. And those are kind of ideational. Sometimes they might be abstract. And some might say, well, very abstract things like what is freedom, what is truth, what is law, what is justice, what is beauty. These kind of abstractions are themselves not aesthetic because they're conceptual. But many aesthetic objects and aesthetic things in the world contain, again, inside of them, some ideational content or some conceptual content. So we can go with that as being part of it. He says, number one, the judgment of taste is aesthetic. So, and again, we're going to deal with Kant's language. He could be kind of priggish. Just forewarned here. In order to decide whether or not something is beautiful, we do not relate the representation by means of understanding to the object for cognition. We don't relate it to, so in other words, understand something beautiful, we do not relate to the object for cognition. So it's not a brain thing. He's using cognition the way we would use it today, more or less. Cognate, but it's not it's not a brain thing necessarily. But rather, related by means of the imagination, perhaps combined with the understanding, it's in parentheses, to the subject and its feeling of pleasure or displeasure. The judgment of taste is therefore not a cognitive judgment, hence not a logical one, but is rather aesthetic, by which is understood one whose determining ground cannot be other than subjective. And so we have one of the most famous statements. When people say there's no accounting for taste, taste is subjective, Kant said it first, and the people that repeat that, the millions of people that in a sing-song manner say that, don't know that they are quoting Kant. It's that form of it here. Cannot be other than subjective. Look, so you could say cannot, look at, see, cannot be other. Bold face, cannot be other than subjective. Any relation of representations, however, even that of sensations, more visceral gut sort of sensations of like, the taste of this coffee or, a beautiful sunset or the storm that may or may not come, all the sensations or the feeling in the body of being a bodily creature that's upright, and all the sensations, and hunger, desire for sleep. Any relation representations can be objective, in which case it signifies what is real in an empirical representation, but not the relation to the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, by means of which nothing at all in the object is designated, but in which the subject feels itself as it is affected by the representation. That's a mouthful, that sentence. It's a great sentence. I'm going to reread it. Bear with me. Any relation of representations, however, even that of sensations, can be objective, in which case it signifies what is real in an empirical representation, but not the relation to the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, by means of which nothing at all in the object is designated, but in which the subject feels itself as it is affected by the representation. To grasp a regular purposive structure with one's faculty of cognition is something entirely different from being conscious of this representation with the sensation of satisfaction. Here the representation is related entirely to the subject, indeed to its feeling of life. Feeling of life, under the name of the feeling of pleasure or displeasure, which grounds an entirely special faculty for discriminating and judging, that contributes nothing to cognition, but only holds the given representation in the subject up to the entire faculty of representation, of which the mind becomes conscious in the feeling of its state. Period. Finally, right? Period. This is a part. I'm going to just a little bit more because I know it's a mouthful, right? It's an earful, probably, right? 2, the satisfaction that determines the judgment of taste is without any interest. And other most important concept is disinterestedness. Now, everybody's talking about 250 in America, the founders. One of the biggest subjects or the hot topics among people like Kant, but also John Locke, Tom Jefferson, Ben Franklin, James Madison, is what we call disinterestedness, which is sort of an ideal mode of cognition, an ideal state of consciousness, and which I have to say, of course, is entirely distinct from and nothing to do with uninterested, right? Disinterestedness. And, for example, Edmund Burke's writings on the Sublime, which I can't get to today, it's too much, goes into these kinds of things. So it's without interest, which means that you're not a party to a dog in the fight. You're not on team A or team B. It's sort of a state sort of above the fray, above all those choices, I guess. And again, we can leave aside whether that's even possible. We can leave, some would say, well, I'm sure I can anticipate all the counter arguments. There is no such thing as disinterestedness. We're always interested. But understand that for disinterestedness includes passion. You could have passions in your loins, passions in your heart, and still at the same time have it be a disinterested passion, which is interesting to think about. So, the satisfaction that we combine with the representation of the existence of an object is called interest. Hence, such a satisfaction always has at the same time a relation to the faculty of desire, either as its determining ground or else as necessarily interconnected with its determining ground. But if the question is whether something is beautiful, one does not want to know whether there is anything that is or that could be at stake for us or for someone else in the existence of the thing, but rather how we judge it in mere contemplation, and he has in parentheses contemplation, intuition, or reflection. If someone asks me whether I find the palace I see before me beautiful, I may well say that I don't like that sort of thing, which is made merely to be gaped at, or like the Iroquois sachem, which is references to things, that nothing in Paris pleased him better than the cook shops. So these references, he even uses the word Rousseau-esque, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. True Rousseau-esque style, I might even vilify the vanity of the great who wastes the sweat of the people on mere superfluous things. So already Kant is referring to Rousseau's activist left-wing criticism of making beautiful things using slave labor. He looks at something beautiful and says, I can't appreciate the beauty because I know the sweat. Kant's referring to that point of view that he identifies with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So everybody's talking about the same things then and now, right? I might vilify the vanity, great phrase there, of the great who waste the sweat of the people on such superfluous things. Finally, I could even easily convince myself that if I were to find myself on an uninhabited island, see the desert island metaphor? Goes back, these things what records of books you take to a desert island? Uninhabited island without any hope of ever coming upon human beings again, and could conjure up such a magnificent structure through my mere wish, I would not even take the trouble of doing so if I already had a hut that was comfortable enough for me. All of this might be conceded by me and approved, but that is not what is at issue here. One only wants to know whether the mere representation of the object is accompanied with satisfaction in me, however indifferent I might be with regard to the existence of the object of this representation. It is readily seen that to say that it is beautiful, beautiful is in boldface, bold print, and to prove that I have taste, what matters is what I make of this representation in myself, not how I depend on the existence of the object. So it's not utilitarian. It's something independent of utility, independent of use, independent of, necessity. And this is an early form of art for art's sake, perhaps, as a possibility. That's why you put the Brillo pad in a gallery space. If you put this is a very different way of relating to these consumer products, Mott's apple juice here, than if you just tear open the box and start drinking the apple juice, or you tear it open because you're doing a load of wash. Very different modes of relating to these objects, these consumer objects. Rauschenberg or Warhol will look at them as, formal or aesthetic objects. Right. Everyone must admit that a judgment about beauty in which there is mixed the least interest is very partial and not a pure judgment of taste. So his tone there, everybody must admit, like we all have to admit that, if we have a little bit of interest, that it's not a pure evaluation, a pure judgment of taste. One must not be in the least biased in favor of the existence of the thing, but must be entirely indifferent in this respect in order to play the judge in matters of taste. We can find no better way of elucidating this proposition, however, which is of the utmost importance, than by contrasting to the pure disinterested satisfaction in the judgment of taste that which is combined with interest, especially if we can be certain that there are not more kinds of interest than those that are to be mentioned now. And he goes on, the agreeable is that which pleases the senses and sensation. And he has words like graceful, lovely, enchanting, enjoyable, etc. And, as if to anticipate objections, he says in a footnote here, a judgment on an object of satisfaction can be entirely disinterested, yet still very interesting. I.e., it is not grounded on an interest, but it produces an interest. All pure moral judgments are like this. So immoral, we leave aside aesthetics, we're into the realm of morality. Judging crimes and condemning crimes, for example, they're without interest, according to this use of the word interest, this formulation. Now, this disinterest talk, again, not to be too on the nose or too topical, but all the foundations of democratic theory that I mentioned in the 18th century of early America and the U.S. at this time, and the philosophers, that the founders of the United States of America, one of the words that they do come around to as being integral to democratic deliberation and even democracy itself is a certain degree of disinterestedness. And of course, the exact opposite of disinterest is the interest of a king or a queen or blood or preference. The kinds of things they were trying to get away from in old Europe or in England. And they saw democracy as in part a disinterested mode of relating to one another. So there is a moral, political dimension to some of these discussions. Not what we're dealing with today, but there's that dimension. And of course, there are critics of all of this. There are people say that it's not possible to be disinterested. As I said, there's no such thing. We're always interested. That my judgment about Farah here on this cup, that I like her, is a biased view, is a view of interest. That's too particular, is too peculiar of a man in a certain time period. Late 20th century sexuality, or late 20th century psychology, and thus is bankrupt, you could say, or somebody might want to have another person on this cup. And you might have vote on who gets to be on the cup, right? You could have there's all kinds of possibilities. You could. I mean, there's just we can be here all day and all night. But even enlisting or including all these objections that I'm coming up with, they don't take away from the truth of what Kant's doing. Is that these are ideals. So there's an ideal of disinterest, an ideal, and in the realm of ideals, we might not always be interested in what's necessary at that moment. And so I'm an aesthete because for me, these kinds of questions, how things feel, the vibes of a thing, are my interest, And so, I take that with me when I compose a piece of music. I mean, I'm going to sit down at the piano in a few minutes and go over some challenges in a piece of music I'm writing now. But, that's so I pull out an old textbook, again, an American history textbook from the 80s. After all, what's on everybody's mind now is 250 in this. So here's something called the American Experience. This is a textbook. Look at the heavy hitters on there. C. Van Woodward and Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Those are the people that wrote this textbook. And so you open it up, and it's a history of the U.S., And this edition is, 1977. Okay, so they keep expanding it, 70s, 80s. This was my high school. This was a high school. I think I had this at Interlochen. I think. With is it Lois Larson was my history teacher? So Lois Larson, we read this history textbook. And we watched All the President's Men. That was a typical post-late 70s, early 80s way to understand history. You watch a movie with, and as Lois Larson says, that one of the delights of watching this movie is looking at Robert Redford. That's the most important part. Now, this is a teacher saying this, not the politics, not the Watergate. I like seeing Redford expressing her own feelings, about a man on the screen, as she did in Michigan. Interlochen, which is an aesthetic judgment, of course, aesthetic appreciation of Robert Redford, similar to my appreciation of Farah here, perhaps. But look at all my little notes. I wrote handwriting and Warren Harding and economic nationalism and the Dow Jones, and the KKK had 5 million members. I wrote here, Dow, all this stuff. The Pullman strikes. Samuel Gompers, higher wages and lower hours. It's a picture of Gompers there. I just opened up randomly. There are my little notes. And if you go through this book, you'll learn some facts about U.S. history. I don't think I need to say that U.S. history is a mixture of good and bad. Again, I keep coming back to this frustration of want to make everything all bad and all good. I mean, I tell you, you have good guys like Samuel Gompers, who forces for good in his own way, and you have villains like Father Coughlin, who preach crap on the radio. Thank God, Father Coughlin today, or Andrew Tate today, whoever these people are, spreading all kinds of awfulness, that gets a mass audience. This is part of American history too, right? And again, this episode is not about politics or ethics, but it's interesting to look at this textbook. But aesthetically, notice how utilitarian, notice how bland this cover is. It's just a bland, you have that, and these little textures, just kind of a dull, boring cover for that textbook. There's aesthetics in everything. There's aesthetics in music production. This is yours truly back when I was 22. This is a cracked album CD. There's me, I think I'm age 20, 21 in that photograph, I think. Amazing, I'm dressed similarly today. But anyhow, this is an old... I used to hate the aesthetics of CD production. I hated the plastic. Everything was plastic containers. It's an old album that I did. Later on, I started to try to use non-plastic as much as possible. I did this, some of these. Something I did in my 50s is this, right? 50, 30 years later. And I came up with this design, the woman in the headphones and the hard listening and everything. This is an album. I have a featured guest, Vivian Arts. This is her packaging of her CDs. It's absolutely extraordinary. So sometimes aesthetics can go all out and give people this wonderful photograph of her looking out at the ocean and the water. Sometimes you produce things that give... Look, you have maps and pictures, and look at all that. Look at all this. And discussion of all these places and the ocean, all this kind of... So this is an example of a very high production value. Who travels from Amsterdam to New York. And so this is giving the consumer or the person who bought this thing a lot to enjoy, I see very high production value. So she's going all out. I mean, I just did this thing, very primitive and basic, photograph. Did what I could at the time, She even gives us like little stickers that people put this on their computer. I guess you put these are all of these birds and this woman at the piano here, I guess presumably her at the piano. You know, and that's a decision that she and her people are making to give, you know, the audience something more, I guess, more valuable or more beautiful, you might say, right? And these are all decisions in the same kind of object in the world of compact disc. You know, we used to have albums, record albums. Record albums, of course, are bigger than CDs, you know. This is an album by Art Farmer. From the 70s, of course. Now, to a contemporary eye, probably the most noteworthy or maybe damning thing is the fact he's posed with he's smoking a cigarette. So in 1975, people were not only were not thinking about lung cancer or thinking about disease or smoking, but smoking in all those 40s and 50s movies, it was closer to that. It was considered maybe cool, and maybe it's a good picture of the artist. Flugelhorn Art Farmer. And if you turn it around, it's the same thing. But it's quite a good photograph of him putting aside the cigarette. So the meaning of objects changes over time when we find out things about an object. In this case, tobacco or cigarettes, you know. And that's a case where we could look at this purely aesthetic. Look at the light and his color photography. Look at it as a portrait of a man, you know. And act as if the cigarette is not there. Or can we? I don't know. Everybody is different, you know, in terms of how they come to objects in the world. And objects in the world, of course, can be performances. So I'm going to sit at the piano and talk about what I call some problems. And these are largely aesthetic problems. In music, I don't know what the sound is like here. I'm going to ask Laurie, is it? And I'm not going to perform here. I'm just going to deal with some what I call challenges. And I'm exposing myself to you, the audience, in terms of... these are themes, and so I have... no. This B flat major. It's something I'm working on. I'm not going to reveal entirely the title of it. So if we do this, it's very sparse, very spare texture. It's part of aesthetics. It's spare. So far, it's just very plain. It's kind of on a certain key, certain level. But we can introduce other things into the sound, like so. you're already changing the emotion just by that movement. So what I guess I call problems or challenges. So one of the problems is this movement. You have, so I know I want to get from that. That sonic information, it's the stuff of the listener. It's like the palette of that. I want to move from that, and I want to get to something like this. One type of information to another type of. So we got. We can use. We can just go right into it. So we can go. So we're continuing this figure up here to synthesize the two. So it's not too jarring for the listener. So there's what we call transition. But you notice the mood. I think it's time to change course. That's all completely improvised. I mean, it's based on some stuff I've had written beforehand, but I hope it's. But you know, that's the question of moving away from something and towards something very different. So then, when we introduce, it gets busier. I also have to decide what what I want to do with it. I'm already making it more and more complex, more and more complex. Maximum complexity. Back to some rhythm. Something I don't know what I'm doing. We're back more or less where we started from. More or less. So I'm having to think about structure while I'm performing it, while I'm doing it. And so I guess we solved a problem there. What are we going to do with this? Start off with these things. How do we develop something, make something interesting, something cohesive? And that's just in sound. And so everybody's always doing that when they make an aesthetic object in the world. They're always deciding, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to figure this out? And people do it in different ways. And I'm just doing it in this way on the fly here. Spontaneously, it's not thought out. But it does relate to some other things in other art forms, of course. And we can't just be talking about art. We can also be talking about textbooks or anything else. So I think I'm going to conclude now. It's been an hour and some piano playing. I hope that came through. And it's just an example. And I'm sure I left a whole bunch of things out that we get to in future episodes. So I'm doing a concert on the 17th here, Friday, and I have some shows coming up. Kinds of future episodes. So like and subscribe to us, tune in, and this podcast is about aesthetics, all things aesthetic. And I am on a journey with all of it. And so thank you, and have a great weekend if you can.